Welcome to Pleasureology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve, the lone pleasureologist, the Hawaiian shirt philosopher, and the sex-positive psychologist. My father was an evangelist. My mother was a nudist. Because she was married to an evangelist, she was a repressed nudist. And so she had to express her nudism around the house, which was fun for me. But I ended up sort of being in the middle of the culture wars between my sex-negative father and my nudist mother. Now, my sex-negative father was supposed to be my parental role model that I identified with. And then my nudist mother was the parent or the parental role model for a person of sexual attraction to me. Because I happen to have inherited an emotional brain which is naturally oriented toward the other sex rather than my same sex. I am attracted to women rather than men. So therefore, my mother was the parent of sexual attraction for me. And so I grew up in the middle of the culture war, the conflict between sexuality and religion. And my emotional brain chose the side of the future, chose the side of sexuality and pleasure and happiness. And I was aided in my choice by the fact that I graduated from high school right when the psychedelic counterculture of the 1960s was getting underway and coming into full bloom. And so I was able to participate in the psychedelic counterculture. A week after I graduated from high school, I took LSD for the first time. And that was particularly helpful in loosening up the stranglehold that Christian indoctrination had on my brain and on my emotions and on my body. LSD took me right out of my ordinary way of looking at things and allowed me to look at the world with fresh eyes and say, why do I have to be running around being scared of God? The world is so beautiful that whatever forces brought this beautiful world into being are not forces that I should be scared of in any way. And in LSD, I experienced for the first time inner peace and calm, genuine relaxation, genuine emotional and physical relaxation. I was so relaxed I could barely get up off the floor, frankly. But it showed me something I hadn't realized, which was that my Christian upbringing and the sexual conflict that I had felt all through puberty between giving myself enjoyable orgasms and feeling guilty and sinful in the eyes of God, this conflict, this emotional conflict, had made me perpetually anxious, perpetually tense. And because I was tense and anxious, I was also very irritable. I would lose my temper often, but because I was so filled with guilt, mostly when I would lose my temper, I would get angry at myself. So I had this kind of masochistic thing going on where I enjoyed punishing myself whenever I didn't do what I thought I should be doing, or whenever I did do something that I thought I shouldn't be doing. So I know a lot of people are going through something similar now, as great numbers of people are waking up and recognizing that Christianity is a make-believe worldview, and we shouldn't let it run our lives anymore. But then the question is, how do we become happy without Christianity? Christianity gave us a source of happiness that was based on fantasies, make-believe fantasies, believing that God was our Father and God loved us and we were going to have eternal life in heaven and all of this stuff. And now if we say, okay, we don't believe that, we have no way of knowing if there are any gods or goddesses whatsoever, because we can't see them or touch them or hear them, except inside our own heads. We can make visions of God inside our own head, but that's our own imagination. And that's what people have been believing for thousands of years, is simply the imaginings that human beings have had in their own head. Then they project them out onto the universe as though those imaginings were real. So that what they do is they make up stories and call them true. They make up stories about what they don't know, how the universe got here, are there any supervisory beings in the universe? They make up stories about them, and then they believe that the stories they made up are true. They write those stories down in a book. The book becomes fixed. There are the words on the page. And for thousands of years, people say these words on the page tell us everything that we don't really know. They tell us all about the unknowable. And we've got to cling to these words. They tell us how to live. They tell us that sex is bad, except in marriage. And we've got to believe that because it's written in this book. And this book was written by human beings thousands of years ago, writing down stories that human beings had imagined and then called true, stories about the unknowable. All right, so if we're going to move past Christianity and leave it behind, and I've studied Christianity in depth because my father was an evangelist. And if you look at the history of the Israelite religion, the Jewish religion, and early Christianity, you see that it is just a whole conglomeration of imaginary ideas about the unknowable that people have fooled themselves, have hypnotized themselves into believing, and it's made them very self-destructive in many ways. When you get imprisoned by a set of imaginary beliefs, and you worship the book that these imaginary beliefs are contained in, and that book becomes your idol, and you can't criticize that book in any way, shape, or form. You just have to do what it says, and you believe that, and you believe that that book tells us about the mind of the multiverse. None of us can know the mind of the multiverse, but we all want to know the mind of the multiverse. And so if we've got a book, it claims to be the mind of the multiverse, written down on the written page. People worship the written page. They worship this book, which in reality is nothing but human imaginings about the unknowable. But you get trapped into doing whatever that book says. If that book says, whoever looks at another person with sexual desire, they've already committed a sin, the sin of adultery, in their heart. And so they're already sinful and impure. And therefore they're already bad in the eyes of God. And if you believe that because you're locked into believing that anything that's written in this book is absolutely true, then you're stuck. You're absolutely stuck hating your own sex drive, because our sex drive is real, whereas the words in the book are imaginary ideas attributed to the mind of the multiverse. And those imaginary ideas don't correspond to the reality of human nature. The reality of human nature and the reality of sexuality is that we are attracted to many, many different people. And in fact, we are built to be attracted sexually to other human beings. When I say we are built by our genetics, by our DNA. that causes us to have a certain brain. And our sex drive is located in our brain. Our sex drive is not located in our penis or vagina. The human brain, which I took some time to study about, the human brain, if that's the front of the brain, and this is the side of the brain, and then down below, that would be where the spinal cord is running down your back. And the brain has two hemispheres, left and right. And if you open the brain up like that, you can see the center of the brain. And in the center of the brain, what you see, the areas that I've colored in yellow on this side, red on this side. This is the area called the emotional brain. And the emotional brain is where our sex drive comes from. It doesn't come from the devil. The devil doesn't put lust into us. Our genes have created circuits, nerve circuits in our brain, in the emotional brain, that respond to sexually attractive people and situations. And the way that our emotional brain responds to sexy situations is by turning us on sexually, by arousing us sexually. What does that mean? That means that the emotional brain sends out sexual arousal energy throughout the rest of our brain and down into our body. And the emotional brain sends nerve impulses down our spine that cause our sexual organs to become sexually aroused, which basically means they fill up with blood. Blood flows into the penis, and that's what makes the penis erect. Blood flows into the vagina. That's what makes the vagina moist. Blood flows into the clitoris and makes the clitoris erect. And it does that when the emotional brain decides that we are in a sexy situation. And that's what the Bible defines as lust. The process of becoming sexually aroused in response to a sexy person and a sexy situation, even if that sexy person and sexy situation are only in our imagination at the moment. It can be real, it can be imaginary, it can be virtual on the computer screen. But whatever the stimulation is, there are nerve circuits in our emotional brain, and those nerve circuits are designed in such a way that they recognize potentially sexy situations. Rather, they recognize situations where there is the potential for sexual activity and sexual fun. Now, why do we have these nerve circuits in our brain? Well, it's because our brains were constructed by a process called natural selection and evolution. Evolution has been taking place for a billion years on our planet, and particularly over the last 600 million years, vertebrates and complex organisms have evolved, come out of the ocean onto land, and we have our ancestors, which are mammal ancestors, primate ancestors, monkey ancestors, and great ape ancestors and chimpanzee ancestors. And all of these ancestors had to have a sex drive. They had to be emotionally driven to engage in sexual activity with fellow members of their species so that they would produce another generation. Anyone who didn't have a sex drive, any of our ancestors that didn't have a sex drive and didn't mate with another member of our species, that person's genes did not get passed on to the next generation. And so those genes without a sex drive, dropped out of the human gene pool, the ancestral gene pool. So we are all descended from millions, perhaps billions of ancestors, all of whom had sex drives, because the sex drive didn't start with mammals. It didn't start with reptiles, didn't start with amphibians. It started somewhere back with the fishes, and very early on, the very early fishes, they had a sex drive. They didn't have penetrative sex, but they had an emotional urge to hover around another fish of the opposite sex, and eventually the female would release her eggs, and the male would release his sperm that would float down on top of the eggs and fertilize them. It was external fertilization. So they were driven to it. They were driven to do this because their emotional brains wouldn't let them not do it. And that's sort of what the sex drive is like. The sex drive really doesn't want to let us not have sex. The purpose of a penis is ejaculation. The other purpose is to pee, but its special purpose is ejaculation. The penis is built to ejaculate sperm, and the vagina is built to receive sperm. And in our brain, we have male and female emotional brains that are designed to seek out a member of the opposite sex and have sex with them. Now, some of us have emotional brains that respond to members of the same sex. And we may be turned on by members of the same sex either exclusively or in addition to being turned on by members of the other sex. And bisexuality is extremely common in the animal kingdom. Dolphins are more bisexual than heterosexual. Male dolphins bond together by sexual activity. So sexual activity is not just for reproduction. Sexual activity is for fun and for bonding with other human beings or with other dolphins. Female bonobos have a lot of sex with other female bonobos, and the female bonobos form friendships and alliance because they're having so much fun together, and they will dominate the bonobo social group. And the females will keep the males in line. The females will be dominant over the males because they will ally themselves against the males, partly because the females are all having clitoris sex. They're rubbing their clitorises together while they hug each other. And that's one of the most common forms of sexual activity in bonobo species, bonobo society. So sex is very deeply embedded in our brains, and that's why we have a sex drive. We don't have a sex drive because we're sinful. Sex is not sinful. Sin is an invalid concept. Sin is a bogus concept. Because here's why. The meaning of sin is something that makes God unhappy, that God doesn't like. All right. So how do we know what God likes or doesn't like? We don't. We don't know if God exists or doesn't exist because God is a non-physical concept. And there's no way that we can observe any non-physical concept, either with our senses or our scientific instruments. So we can know absolutely zero about God, or the mind of the multiverse. If it's all non-physical, we have no information about it. As Paul Simon said in one of his songs, God only knows when God makes his plan. The information's unavailable to the mortal man. We don't know anything about God, whether God exists or not. And therefore, to label something as sinful is to commit the most egregious intellectual sin that there is. I know, I just said sin was an invalid concept. Let's call it an intellectual crime. The intellectual crime is believing that you know something that you don't know on the basis of imagination. On the basis of nothing but imagination. You say, I claim to know that sex is sinful in these circumstances. That's what my father taught me. Gave me a little book, When he found out I was masturbating, gave me a little book telling me that masturbation was sinful, and sex outside of marriage was sinful, etc. And the book also made it feel like sex even within marriage was pretty icky. I didn't know what sex was until I read the book, and after I read the book, I still didn't know. I thought you had to do it from behind, and that didn't really appeal to me. But anyway, calling sex a sin is a bogus concept, a bogus idea, because we have no idea what the mind of the multiverse might approve of or disapprove of. Okay, sin is something the mind of the multiverse is supposed to not approve of. Virtue or being good is what the mind of the multiverse is supposed to approve of. But we don't know the mind of the multiverse. There's nothing more arrogant for human beings to claim than that they know the mind of the multiverse. That's a false truth claim, and that's an intellectual crime. To falsely claim that you know something on the basis of nothing but imagination. So, my philosophical position on this is what I call agnostic realism. We know what's real. We encounter what's real every time we bump into it. Every time we hit our elbow on something or whatever, we can see what's real all around us. And if we walk up to that thing and touch it, we can feel that it's real. We know the difference between reality and imagination. And so what we know to be real, particularly if we've investigated it scientifically, what we know to be real is real. And I believe that that really exists. But what we don't know anything about, we don't know anything about. I am a complete agnostic, a complete skeptic about anything non-physical. And I believe that agnosticism is more than just saying, well, I don't know if God exists or not. So I can't say. I don't know whether to believe in God or not. That's kind of wimpy agnosticism. Or as Stephen Colbert once called it, he said, isn't an agnostic just an atheist without balls? And that's the wimpy atheist who just, can't decide. And that's the wimpy agnostic. But the philosophically rigorous agnostic, which I am, I'm a militant agnostic. What I mean is, I militantly believe that it is a crime, a moral and ethical crime, for anyone to claim to know anything about what we don't in fact know, anything non-physical. It's an intellectual crime. It's a crime against humanity to claim to know anything about the unknowable. The only thing we can know about the unknowable for sure, we can know that we don't know anything about the unknowable. That's all. That's the one true statement we can make about the unknowable, is we know nothing about it, and we shouldn't pretend to. And people who pretend to know about the unknowable and then use that excuse to run other people's lives and to make them feel frightened of the unknowable and to keep them in line sexually and every other way, those people are fascists. They are totalitarian, they are authoritarian, and they are doing it so illegitimately because the authority that they base themselves on is completely imaginary. It's imaginary speculations about the unknowable. And as a militant agnostic, I believe that is a crime against humanity because it makes us unnecessarily unhappy, especially in the area of sexuality. I believe we should not let our lives be ruled at all by any speculations about the unknowable. We should not let our lives be ruled by imaginary supervisors. And that's what Christians do. They imagine a supervisor, they worship the supervisor, they believe the supervisor is watching them every second of the day and night, so that they can't possibly do anything that the supervisor, the imaginary supervisor, doesn't see. And they let their lives be imprisoned by that imaginary fear of an imaginary supervisor. Actually, the fear is not imaginary. The fear is real. And that's the problem with imaginary worldviews, like Christianity or any other religion. An imaginary worldview, if you believe that it's true, will give you real emotions of fear and self-disgust, fear and anger, fear and sinfulness, all kinds of very real emotions that create tension throughout your body. And your body gradually becomes permanently tense. And that's what happened when I took LSD, was that LSD temporarily relaxed me completely, emotionally and physically. And I experienced a whole different way of being relaxed, feeling calm, not feeling anxious, not feeling sinful, not feeling afraid of the universe, but feeling like I could be connected with the universe. The universe is not a place for me to be frightened of. I belong to the universe. I belong in this beautiful world. And the question was, though, when I came down from the LSD, and I went back to being anxious and tense, because it was a habit that my emotional brain had formed over many years of Christian indoctrination, this habit of tension and anxiety, how could I get rid of it permanently? Not just when I was high on LSD. Because once we accept the idea that the meaning of life is to enjoy life while we're living it, it's only going to go on for a certain amount of time. And then we're going to die. And when we die, the only thing that happens is our consciousness evaporates and we forget we ever lived. We're not aware that we're no longer alive. And there is no time. There's no experience and no time. Death is something none of us will ever experience, because consciousness is created by the brain. When the brain stops working, consciousness evaporates. It's like turning off the TV, powering down, the computer. The image that was there before just isn't there anymore. And our problem is, it's hard for us to imagine what it's like to not be conscious unless we've had the experience of it. And there is no experience to not being conscious. The only way that we can know that we've had a period of not being conscious is if we have 2 periods of disconnected consciousness, which happens, for instance, if you have an operation and you're given anesthesia. You remember being given the anesthesia, and then you wake up immediately. And nothing has happened in between, but like if you've had your tonsils out, you've just all of a sudden got the worst sore throat you ever had in your life. But just a second ago, I was going under the anesthesia, and now it's an hour or two later, I don't know, and I'm awake and my throat is sore, but no time had passed. And there's no experience of what happened during that time. That's what death is. Death is a complete non-experience that lasts for no length of time whatsoever, because we can only be aware of the passing of time if we have a consciousness. So if we don't have a consciousness, we're not aware of the passing of time. And we're not aware of the fact that we don't have a consciousness. It's not like we're there and we're wondering, where the hell's my consciousness? Why am I just floating here in the middle of darkness, on and on, without a consciousness? You'd have to have a consciousness in order to even be aware of not having a consciousness. So, not having a consciousness is simply the fact that we're not there. We are, in fact, our consciousness. And so when we die, poof, we're not there anymore. We're not aware that we're not there. We don't notice being dead. Death is unnoticeable. Death is an experience none of us are ever going to have. And that's why the ancient philosopher Epicurus said, why should I worry about death? Why should I even think about death? I'm never going to experience death. If I'm here, and I know I'm here, then I'm not dead. But if death comes, that means I'm not here anymore. My consciousness has already evaporated. So none of us is ever going to know death. None of us is ever going to experience death. The only thing we're ever going to experience is being alive. We're alive now as human beings, as a human consciousness. At some point, that consciousness, that human consciousness, will evaporate because our brain will shut down permanently. It happens to us every night. Our brain goes through dreamless sleep every night. We go through the exact non-experience of death many times per night. But we never remember it because there's nothing to remember. There's nothing to experience, nothing to remember. So, if this is the case, then we obviously don't want to waste our lives living in such a way that we hope we will go on living when we're dead. And we hope that it'll be a happy life instead of an unhappy life. And that's what the Christians are keeping you hooked with, the imaginary idea that life goes on after the brain shuts down. That consciousness somehow can float out of the body and float up into space somewhere, the soul. See, the concept of the soul is just as bogus a concept as the concept of sin. The concept of the soul is the idea that we could have consciousness without having a brain attached to it, or without having a brain that produces that consciousness. Excuse me. We know from observing the brain's activity that consciousness is only generated at certain times when certain nerve circuits are on. And when those nerve circuits shut down, consciousness is not there. And the losing of consciousness is not painful. We go through the loss of consciousness every night, several times. But it's never painful. And I've gone through losing consciousness while I was completely conscious of the fact that my consciousness was going away, and it was a delightful experience. It was euphoric. It was wonderful to let go of the pain of my body, to let go of everything, and to just sort of have my consciousness narrow down into nothing and then go poof and disappear. There was no pain involved whatsoever. Losing consciousness is not painful. The losing of consciousness itself is not painful. But it's foolish of us to live our lives expecting that our consciousness will persist, will float away from our body and persist forever. This was the idea that Plato came up with about 400 BC, this crazy idea that consciousness can be separated from the body and can go on lasting forever. And then Christianity latches onto this idea and says, yeah, and guess what? It can either go on in a happy place or an unhappy place. And you've got to do what we Christians say in order for your consciousness to go to the happy place instead of the unhappy place. And this is a form of imaginary blackmail. Okay, it's blackmail using fear of the imaginary. The imaginary is the idea that consciousness can exist apart from the brain, which we do not see anywhere. When we look at the real world, we see consciousness only in organisms that have brains and nervous systems. We see consciousness nowhere else. And no matter what we believe about the unknowable, we're not going to change the fact that our consciousness evaporates when our brain shuts down. We might find ourselves inside another organism, maybe 100 billion years from now, in a different multiverse, in a different part of the multiverse. And we might find ourselves in another organism with a consciousness. And if there were 100 billion years between the end of our human consciousness and the time that we find ourselves in another organism, conscious because we're part of that organism that has a brain and creates consciousness, there would be no separation between those two consciousnesses. The new consciousness would start immediately after the old consciousness ends. 100 billion years of being without consciousness doesn't last any time at all, because there's no consciousness to experience that 100 billion years with. So it's possible that we will just experience all consciousness all the time, but in different living organisms with different brains. We don't really know that. And each of those lives, each of those periods of consciousness would be self-contained. We wouldn't remember any previous periods. And we would only remember this period of consciousness as long as it lasts. And then if it did end, then another consciousness would begin immediately, perhaps. It would appear to begin immediately, even if there was 100 billion years in between. That next consciousness would appear to begin immediately, but it would be self-contained. It would be in a new organism, a fresh organism. And so the only thing we can ever possibly experience is being conscious and alive. That's the only thing it's possible to experience. We cannot experience death. And there's nothing we can do about it. That's the facts. That's just the scientific reality of the situation. So it doesn't matter what imaginary beliefs people have. That's not their beliefs. Their imaginary beliefs about what happens to us is not going to change the reality of the fact that this human consciousness is finite. All right. So we can say, gee, I'd love to be a human being forever. I wish I could be a human being for 1,000 years. But you would only want that if your body, of course, could also be young, because by the time you get to my age, I'm 77, even though I've taken the best possible care of my body all these years, it's becoming more and more difficult to enjoy my body. At some point, our bodies get old enough that we say, life is not more enjoyable than less enjoyable. Why should I keep on living unless there's a surplus of happiness over unhappiness? But the important thing is this, that we can learn to create a surplus of happiness over unhappiness in our lives. And that's what I learned to do because I was lucky enough to live during the psychedelic counterculture of the 1960s. And so I experienced a combination of different educational inputs. And I'm not just talking about intellectual, but body-mind education. I got a body-mind education that involved my body, my emotions, and my consciousness, all three. That's what you need for a well-rounded happiness education. And I learned how to be happy. I learned the secret of being happy. And it was only because there was this combination, this very interesting combination of factors that occurred during the counterculture. Now, my purpose with these videos is to pass on the information to you about how I learned to actually feel good while I was living. Euphoria is the meaning of life. Euphoria means pleasant consciousness, consciousness that feels good emotionally and physically. Euphoria is the meaning of life. Dysphoria, feeling bad, is when your life is not working, when it's not succeeding. Success in life is having a euphoric life, and that doesn't. It can't be had by earning a lot of money and having a successful career. There are many, many people who have earned a lot of money, had a successful career, and are still incapable of euphoria. If the meaning of life is to spend as much time in euphoria as possible while we're living, the project of life is making ourselves capable of generating and experiencing euphoria. We have to become euphoria capable, and that's what I was not. I was not euphoria capable when I first took LSD. The LSD gave me an experience of genuine euphoria, genuine emotional relaxation and calmness, and feeling good from head to toe. But other than that, if I wasn't high on LSD, then I wasn't euphoric. And then when I started using cannabis, sometimes I would get paranoid. Cannabis wasn't reliable for me because of my Christian upbringing, because of the imaginary fears in the back of my consciousness, and because my body was so tense. I could get off on all kinds of paranoid trips when I was high on cannabis. And so cannabis was sometimes helpful, but sometimes not. But then eventually, around 1972, beginning of 1972, end of 1971, I began to experience a number of things that helped me learn how to completely relax, how to relax emotionally and physically, how to share nurturing affection with other people, and how to have more expansive sexual pleasure. And that was a very important part. Sexual pleasure is a very important part of euphoria. Some of our most euphoric experiences are sexual experiences. And so during this counterculture period, I learned about the psychology of the expansion of sexual pleasure. And I learned about that from the first counterculture psychotherapist who lived way back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, a man named Wilhelm Reich, or Reich, R-E-I-C-H. He was a he was an Austrian psychoanalyst who came to the United States, and he was the first counterculture psychotherapist because he really wanted to help his patients have better orgasms. He recognized that our sex drive is a biological sex drive. It needs to be satisfied. And so he would tell that to his patients and say, you shouldn't feel guilty about satisfying your sex drive. Go ahead and satisfy your sex drive. And then they would go ahead and have intercourse with someone, but they still wouldn't feel that great. And they still wouldn't feel that sexually satisfied because their sexual experiences weren't that pleasurable. And so Reich realized that it was our tension, built-in tension in the muscles and the emotions, the fact that we weren't capable of letting our emotions out, and the fact that we weren't capable of feeling our bodies because our muscles were constantly tense. And this was causing us to have constricted orgasms. This was causing his patients to have constricted orgasms rather than expansive ones. And I thought about myself and I said, that is exactly what has happened to me. When I first was having orgasms, when I first hit puberty, I was having big orgasms, totally satisfying orgasms, wonderful orgasms. And then after my father made me feel guilty about masturbating and having orgasms, my orgasms had to be covert, and they were associated with anxiety and hiding and tension and worried about getting caught. And so gradually over the years, my orgasms had become smaller and smaller and less satisfying. But I hadn't noticed it until I read Wilhelm Reich. And then I said, yeah, that's what happened to me. I need to get Reichian therapy. And the only place to get Reichian therapy was in New York. And it was expensive, and I couldn't do that. I was just a poor college student with no money. So I thought, well, fuck it. I'm never going to have really great orgasms the way that I could if I was able to go through Reichian therapy. So luckily, I didn't go through Reichian therapy because, as it turns out, Reich never really solved the problem of helping people relax away their physical tension, their emotional tension, and have better orgasms. He was not successful in his therapy. And so instead, I just did a sort of a freelance self-therapy program over the next few years. And because I had the framework of Reich's theory that orgasms were constricted by tension, and that what we needed to do was get rid of the tension and allow the orgasms to expand, because I had this basic idea already in my mind, I was able to make use of the various techniques of relaxation and pleasure expansion that I encountered during the next few years in the counterculture, the psychedelic counterculture. And unfortunately, this is what most hippies never got. They got drugs, they got rock and roll, and they got sex. But they never got what I would call euphoriogenic self-therapy. Euphoria creating self-therapy, how to turn oneself into a euphorically capable human being, capable eventually of having cosmic orgasms, meaning orgasms that fill your whole brain and your whole body, and it feels like the whole cosmos is having an orgasm with you. That is what I learned how to do during those next few years, and next time I will tell you exactly how I did that.